Hey everyone, today we're examining one of the most devastating tragedies in modern history, the events at Jonestown, Guyana, in 1978. This isn't a story we tell for entertainment, but rather one we must understand to recognize the warning signs and prevent such tragedies from happening again. So before we dive in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now get comfortable, because we're about to examine this complex and heartbreaking story together. We'll explore how a man who began preaching racial integration and social justice in 1950s Indiana ended up leading 918 people to their deaths in the jungles of Guyana. The story begins not in the jungle, but in the American Midwest during the height of the Civil Rights era. James Warren Jones was born in 1931 in rural Indiana, to a disabled World War I veteran and a working mother. From an early age, Jones showed an unusual intensity about religion and social issues. As a teenager, he was known for conducting funeral services for dead animals and preaching to other children. But what made him different from other young preachers was his genuine commitment to racial integration at a time when that was dangerous in Indiana. In 1955, Jones founded the People's Temple in Indianapolis. What attracted people initially was revolutionary for its time. This was one of the first truly integrated churches in America. Jones and his wife Marceline adopted children of different races, creating what they called a rainbow family. The church fed the hungry, housed the homeless, and provided health care to those who couldn't afford it. For many African Americans facing discrimination and white liberals seeking to live their values, the People's Temple felt like a beacon of hope. But here's where we need to understand something crucial about cult psychology. Legitimate good works can mask dangerous control mechanisms. Jones was studying the techniques of other religious leaders, particularly those who commanded absolute loyalty. He began implementing what experts now recognize as classic cult tactics, but so gradually that most members didn't recognize what was happening. The first warning sign was Jones's claim to divine powers. He would stage fake healings, having accomplices research members' medical histories so he could miraculously know their conditions. He would have people plant chicken livers in their clothes, then dramatically remove tumors during services. These deceptions weren't random, they were calculated to establish his authority as someone with supernatural abilities. What made Jones particularly dangerous was his ability to exploit genuine social injustices. He would point to real racism, real poverty, real government failures, and position himself as the only solution. This wasn't entirely wrong. His church did provide real help to people who desperately needed it, but he used these good works to justify increasingly controlling behavior. The psychological manipulation escalated slowly. Jones began requiring members to turn over their paychecks, their property, even their children's custody to the church. He called these tests of faith, but they were actually techniques to make leaving increasingly difficult. He instituted catharsis sessions, where members would confess their sins and be publicly humiliated. He created an atmosphere where questioning his authority was equivalent to betraying the community. Now, to understand what happened next, we need to recognize that Jones was becoming increasingly paranoid. The civil rights movement was facing violent backlash, and Jones genuinely feared nuclear war between the United States and Soviet Union. He convinced his followers that they needed to create a socialist paradise away from American society. In the early 1970s, he began sending advance teams to Guyana to establish what he called the People's Temple Agricultural Project. The location wasn't random. Guyana was a newly independent nation with a socialist government that welcomed Jones's promises of agricultural development. The 800-acre site was remote, accessible only by small plane or boat. Jones told his followers this would be their utopia, a place where they could live without racism, without poverty, without fear of nuclear war. But isolation is a classic cult tactic. By moving his followers to a remote location, Jones could control every aspect of their lives. Communication with the outside world was severely restricted. Letters were censored. Phone calls were monitored. Members worked up to 11 hours a day in brutal tropical heat, with little food and less sleep. This wasn't accidental. Exhaustion and malnutrition make people more susceptible to psychological manipulation. The most chilling aspect was how Jones prepared his followers for what he euphemistically called revolutionary suicide. He held regular drills where members would drink what they were told was poison, and then be told it was just a test of their loyalty. He called these events White Nights, claiming they were necessary because enemies were coming to destroy their community. Each drill made the idea of mass suicide seem more normal, more acceptable. What's crucial to understand is that many members knew something was wrong. Some tried to leave but were prevented by armed guards. Others were too afraid to speak up because they had witnessed public beatings of anyone who questioned Jones. Some stayed because they genuinely believed in the community's ideals and thought they could reform it from within. Many remained because leaving meant abandoning elderly parents, spouses, or children who refused to go. The tragedy reached its climax on November 18, 1978, when Congressman Leo Ryan arrived in Jonestown to investigate reports of abuse. Ryan was there because concerned relatives had contacted him, begging him to check on their family members. This wasn't a surprise visit. Hugh Jones had been preparing for this moment, telling his followers that government agents were coming to destroy them. During Ryan's visit, several members approached him asking to leave. This was exactly what Jones had feared, his external validation that people wanted to escape. As Ryan's party prepared to leave with several defectors, Jones ordered his followers to attack them at the airstrip. Ryan and 4 others were killed. Back in Jonestown, Jones gathered his followers and told them the time had come for revolutionary suicide. He claimed that soldiers were coming to torture and kill them, that their only choice was to die with dignity. The poison was real this time. Cyanide mixed with a flavored drink. Jones started with the children, telling parents that if they truly loved their kids, they would save them from the torture that was coming. This is where we need to understand the most heartbreaking aspect of this tragedy. And for many people, this wasn't suicide in any meaningful sense. It was murder. Parents watched their children die before drinking the poison themselves. Those who hesitated were forced to drink at gunpoint. Some tried to run into the jungle, but were shot. Of the 918 people who died that day, 304 were children who had no choice in the matter. The audio recording of those final moments, which investigators found later, reveals the horror of what happened. You can hear children crying, adults pleading, and Jones calmly giving orders for the killing to continue. He told his followers they were going to meet again in another place, but there was no dignity in what happened. Only manipulation, coercion, and murder. What they discovered when investigators finally reached Jonestown changed everything about how we understand cult psychology. This wasn't a case of religious fanatics choosing death over life. It was the end result of years of systematic psychological manipulation, isolation, and abuse. The people who died weren't weak or gullible. They were victims of sophisticated control techniques that can affect anyone under the right circumstances. The survivors' stories help us understand how this happened. Those who escaped describe a gradual process of losing their individual identity and critical thinking abilities. They talk about how Jones isolated them from outside information, created an us versus them mentality, and made questioning his authority seem like betrayal of the community. They describe how physical and emotional exhaustion made it harder to think clearly, and how fear of punishment silenced dissent. But here's where things get really important for all of us today. The techniques Jones used aren't unique to religious cults. They are the same methods used by abusive partners, authoritarian political movements, and exploitative organizations. The warning signs are consistent: isolation from outside support, demands for absolute loyalty, punishment for questioning authority, and the gradual erosion of personal autonomy. The story takes on even more relevance when we consider how these dynamics play out in our current media environment. Social media algorithms can create echo chambers that mirror the information control Jones used. Online communities can develop the same us versus them mentality that made questioning dangerous in Jonestown. The same psychological vulnerabilities that made people susceptible to Jones's manipulation, the need for belonging, the desire for purpose, the fear of being alone, are still present in all of us. Understanding Jonestown isn't about judging the victims or their families. It's about recognizing that under the right circumstances, any of us could be vulnerable to these techniques. The people who joined the People's Temple were trying to create a better world. They were motivated by genuine desires for racial justice, economic equality, and spiritual fulfillment. Their tragedy lies not in their idealism, but in how that idealism was exploited by someone who understood exactly how to manipulate human psychology. The lessons from Jonestown have transformed how we understand and respond to cult activities. Mental health professionals now recognize the signs of psychological coercion. Law enforcement agencies have developed protocols for dealing with dangerous groups. Families have learned to recognize warning signs when loved ones become involved in controlling organizations. But perhaps the most important lesson is about the power of outside connections. Almost every survivor of Jonestown emphasizes how important it was to maintain relationships with people outside the community. Those who had the strongest external ties were most likely to recognize that something was wrong and most able to leave. And this is why isolation is such a powerful tool of control. It eliminates the outside perspectives that might help people see their situation clearly. The physical evidence left behind in Jonestown tells the story of a community that started with genuine ideals but became a prison. There were agricultural projects that could have fed thousands, medical facilities that could have provided healthcare, and schools that could have educated children. All of these were real achievements that Jones used to justify his control. But there were also armed guards, punishment cells, and ultimately, the vats of poison that ended 918 lives. What we must remember is that each of those 918 people was an individual with their own story, their own dreams, their own reasons for joining what they hoped would be a better community. They included elderly people seeking security, young idealists wanting to change the world, children who had no choice in their fate, and parents trying to provide better lives for their families. Their deaths weren't the result of weakness or stupidity. They were the victims of sophisticated psychological manipulation combined with physical coercion. The aftermath of Jonestown continues to ripple through our society today. Survivors and family members still struggle with trauma, guilt, and the challenge of rebuilding their lives. The governments of both the United States and Guyana have had to confront how such a tragedy could happen under their watch. Researchers continue to study the psychological and social factors that made this possible, hoping to prevent similar tragedies in the future. But the most powerful legacy of Jonestown may be in the stories of those who survived and those who chose to speak out. Their courage in sharing their experiences has educated countless others about the dangers of psychological manipulation and the importance of maintaining critical thinking, even within communities we love and trust. As we reflect on this tragedy, we must remember that the victims of Jonestown weren't naive or weak. They were people seeking meaning, community, and justice in a world that often seemed lacking in all three. Their tragedy reminds us that our most noble impulses, the desire to help others, to create a better world, to find spiritual meaning, can be exploited by those who understand human psychology and are willing to use that knowledge for control rather than service. The story of Jonestown is ultimately a story about the importance of maintaining our individual critical thinking abilities even when we're part of groups we believe in. It's about the danger of giving any person or organization absolute authority over our lives. And it's about the responsibility we all have to stay connected to diverse perspectives and to question leaders who demand unthinking loyalty. Most importantly, it's a reminder that the 918 people who died in Jonestown were human beings with names, families, dreams, and stories. They deserve to be remembered not just as victims of a cult, but as individuals who were trying to build something better and whose lives were cut short by someone who exploited their trust and idealism. Their memory calls us to be vigilant against the kind of psychological manipulation that led to their deaths, while also remaining open to the genuine community and social justice they were seeking. In this way, we can honor their lives by learning from their tragedy and working to ensure that such exploitation never happens again. To truly understand how this tragedy unfolded, we need to examine the specific techniques Jones used to gain and maintain control over his followers. These weren't random acts of a madman, but calculated strategies that experts now recognize as textbook examples of psychological coercion. Understanding these techniques helps us recognize them in other contexts and protect ourselves and our loved ones from similar manipulation. Jones's first major technique was what psychologists call love bombing, overwhelming potential recruits with attention, affection, and a sense of belonging. New members of the People's Temple were made to feel like they had found their true family. Existing members would shower them with compliments, include them in social activities, and make them feel special and valued. This created what researchers call a pseudo-personality, nush. The person began to see themselves through the eyes of the group, rather than maintaining their individual identity. The social context of 1960s and 1970s America made Jones's message particularly appealing. The country was torn apart by racial violence, the Vietnam War, and economic uncertainty. Many people felt disconnected from traditional institutions and were searching for alternatives. Jones positioned his movement as the answer to America's problems, offering a vision of racial harmony and economic justice that seemed impossible to achieve anywhere else. What made Jones particularly dangerous was his ability to identify and exploit individual vulnerabilities. He would assign trusted members to befriend newcomers and gather detailed information about their backgrounds, fears, and desires. This intelligence was then used to craft personalized appeals that made joining the temple seem like the obvious solution to their problems. A lonely widow might be told she had found a family that would never abandon her. A young idealist might be convinced they were joining the most important social justice movement of their time. The temple's organizational structure was deliberately designed to isolate members from outside influences. Jones created multiple layers of leadership, with each level having access to different information and different privileges. This prevented any single person from seeing the full scope of the organization's activities. Members were encouraged to inform on each other, creating an atmosphere of mutual surveillance that made private dissent extremely dangerous. Financial control was another crucial element of Jones's strategy. New members were initially asked to make small donations or volunteer a few hours of their time. But these requests gradually escalated until members were turning over their entire paychecks, their property, and even their children's custody to the organization. This wasn't presented as exploitation, but as evidence of their commitment to the cause. Those who hesitated were made to feel selfish and uncommitted compared to more dedicated members. The psychological pressure was reinforced by physical exhaustion and social isolation. Members worked long hours at temple businesses or community projects, attended mandatory meetings several nights a week, and participated in social activities that consumed their remaining free time. This schedule left little time for reflection, private relationships, or contact with the outside world. Sleep deprivation and poor nutrition further weakened their ability to think critically about their situation. Jones also used a technique called thought stopping, filling his followers' minds with so much information and activity that they couldn't process what was happening to them. Members were required to listen to Jones's recorded sermons for hours each day, attend multiple meetings per week, and participate in constant group activities. The barrage of information and demands made it almost impossible for individuals to step back and evaluate their situation objectively. The sexual exploitation that occurred within the temple demonstrates another dimension of Jones's control. He convinced his followers that traditional sexual relationships were selfish and that all sexual energy should be directed toward him as the leader. This wasn't presented as personal gratification, but as a spiritual practice that would help achieve their collective goals. Members who questioned this were accused of being hung up on bourgeois morality and lacking true revolutionary commitment. Perhaps most insidiously, Jones used his followers' own values against them. Many members had joined because they genuinely believed in racial justice and helping the poor. When they witnessed abuse or began to have doubts, Jones would remind them of all the good work the temple was doing and make them feel guilty for putting their personal concerns ahead of the greater cause. This created a psychological trap where leaving felt like betraying everything they claimed to believe in. The children in Jonestown deserve special attention because their experiences reveal the full horror of Jones's control. Children were separated from their parents and raised communally, with Jones positioning himself as their primary authority figure. They were subjected to brutal punishments for minor infractions, forced to work long hours in dangerous conditions, and given minimal education beyond temple doctrine. Many of these children had been born into the temple or brought there as infants, meaning they had never known any other way of life. The educational system in Jonestown was carefully designed to reinforce Jones's authority and isolate children from outside influences. Students learned basic reading and math, but their primary curriculum consisted of temple doctrine and socialist ideology. They were taught that the outside world was evil and that Jones was their protector. Critical thinking skills were actively discouraged, and children who asked too many questions were punished for being disrespectful. The daily life of adults in Jonestown was structured to maintain constant psychological pressure. Webbers woke before dawn to work in agricultural projects under the scorching Guianese sun. They received minimal food, often just rice and beans, and inadequate medical care. Living conditions were cramped and unsanitary, with multiple families sharing small cabins. Privacy was non-existent, and every conversation was subject to monitoring by Jones's security team. The armed guards who patrolled Jonestown weren't just symbolic, they were there to prevent escapes and enforce Jones's will through violence. Several members who attempted to leave were physically prevented from doing so. Others were beaten or placed in isolation as punishment for questioning temple policies. The presence of weapons created an atmosphere of fear that made open resistance extremely dangerous. Jones's paranoia increased dramatically during the final months before the tragedy. He became convinced that the CIA, the FBI, and other government agencies were planning to destroy the temple. He told his followers that they were surrounded by enemies who wanted to separate families, torture children, and destroy their socialist paradise. This wasn't entirely delusional. The temple was indeed being investigated by various agencies, and Jones knew that his criminal activities could lead to prosecution. The White Night rehearsals for mass suicide became more frequent and intense during this period. Jones would wake the entire community in the middle of the night, claiming that enemies were approaching and that they had to choose between death and capture. Members would be forced to drink what they were told was poison, then wait to see if they would die. When nothing happened, Jones would congratulate them on their loyalty and tell them they had passed another test. These rehearsals served multiple psychological purposes. They desensitized members to the idea of mass suicide, making it seem like a reasonable response to external threats. They reinforced Jones's control by demonstrating that he literally held the power of life and death over his followers. And they created a sense of collective identity around the willingness to die for the cause, making survival seem like cowardice or betrayal. The relationship between Jones and the Guyanese government added another layer of complexity to the situation. Guyanese Socialist Prime Minister Forbes Burnham saw the temple as a valuable source of foreign currency and agricultural development. The government largely ignored reports of abuse and refused to investigate conditions in Jonestown. This official support made it even more difficult for members to seek help or escape. When Congressman Leo Ryan began investigating the temple, Jones saw this as the beginning of the end. Ryan's visit represented everything Jones had taught his followers to fear: a government interference that would destroy their community and separate families. The fact that several members asked to leave with Ryan confirmed Jones's worst fears about disloyalty within the ranks. The attack on Ryan's party at the airstrip was carefully planned and executed. Jones's security team used automatic weapons to kill Ryan and 4 others, including 3 journalists and a temple defector. This wasn't a spontaneous act of desperation, but a calculated decision to eliminate witnesses who could expose the truth about Jonestown. Jones knew that once government officials had been killed, there would be no going back. The final hours in Jonestown reveal the full horror of what Jones had created. The audio recordings from that day capture Jones calmly giving orders for the murder of hundreds of people, including children. He told his followers that they were choosing death over persecution, but the reality was that most had no choice. Those who hesitated were forced to drink at gunpoint. Parents were made to watch their children die before drinking the poison themselves. The poison itself was a mixture of cyanide, sedatives, and a flavored drink mix. Jones had tested various formulations to find one that would work quickly and be difficult to detect. The addition of sedatives was particularly cruel. It ensured that people would lose consciousness before they could change their minds or try to help others. Children were given the poison first, ostensibly to spare them from witnessing the adults' deaths, but really to eliminate any possibility that parents might resist. Some members did try to escape during those final hours. A few succeeded in reaching the jungle, where they hid until rescue teams arrived. Others were shot by guards as they tried to flee. The physical evidence left behind shows clear signs of struggle, contradicting Jones's claims about voluntary death. Syringes found at the scene indicate that some victims were forcibly injected with poison when they refused to drink it. The international response to the Jonestown tragedy was swift and horrified. The images of hundreds of bodies lying in the jungle shocked the world and raised urgent questions about how such a thing could happen. The U.S. government faced criticism for not acting sooner on reports of abuse, while the Guyanese government was questioned about its failure to monitor conditions in the settlement. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of Jones's criminal activities. Financial records showed that he had stolen millions of dollars from his followers, much of which was hidden in foreign bank accounts. Evidence of systematic abuse, including the sexual exploitation of minors, led to posthumous criminal charges that would have sent Jones to prison for life. The discovery of a large arsenal of weapons raised questions about Jones's ultimate intentions and whether he had been planning even more violence. The psychological profiles of the victims challenged many stereotypes about cult members. They included college professors, nurses, social workers, and other educated professionals. Many were longtime civil rights activists who had impressive records of community service. What they shared wasn't naivety or weakness, but a genuine desire to create a more just society and a willingness to sacrifice personal comfort for collective goals. The families left behind faced enormous challenges in recovering from the tragedy. Many lost multiple relatives, including entire branches of their family trees. The stigma associated with cult membership made it difficult to find support or understanding from their communities. Lawsuits against the temple's remaining assets dragged on for years, preventing closure and adding financial stress to emotional trauma. The survivors who escaped Jonestown, or were away from the settlement during the final day, faced their own unique challenges. Many struggled with survivors' guilt, wondering why they had been spared when so many others died. Some were ostracized by their communities for having been associated with Jones. Others faced financial ruin because they had turned over their assets to the temple. The children who survived faced particular difficulties. Many had lost their parents and all their siblings, leaving them completely alone in the world. Those who had been born into the temple had no experience with life outside the organization and struggled to adapt to normal society. Educational deficits from their time in Jonestown made it difficult for them to succeed academically or professionally. The mental health community learned important lessons from treating Jonestown survivors. Traditional therapy approaches proved inadequate for dealing with the complex trauma of cult involvement. Survivors needed specialized treatment that addressed not just the immediate trauma of the tragedy, but also the longer-term effects of psychological manipulation and social isolation. This led to the development of new therapeutic approaches specifically designed for cult survivors. The media coverage of Jonestown also raised important questions about how such tragedies should be reported. Initial coverage focused on the sensational aspects of the story: the charismatic leader, the exotic location, the shocking death toll. This approach inadvertently reinforced stereotypes about cult members and missed the more important story about systematic abuse and psychological manipulation. Later, more thoughtful reporting began to examine the social and psychological factors that made the tragedy possible. Journalists began interviewing survivors and family members to understand the human story behind the headlines. This shift in coverage helped educate the public about the realities of cult involvement and the techniques used to control vulnerable people. The legal aftermath of Jonestown led to important changes in how law enforcement agencies monitor and respond to dangerous groups. The FBI developed new protocols for investigating reports of abuse in isolated communities. Immigration authorities began paying closer attention to religious groups that relocate large numbers of followers to foreign countries. These changes, while not foolproof, have helped prevent some potentially dangerous situations from escalating. The academic study of cults and high-control groups expanded dramatically after Jonestown. Researchers began systematically documenting the techniques used by manipulative leaders and the psychological factors that make people vulnerable to recruitment. This research has been invaluable in helping family members understand what happened to their loved ones and in developing prevention and intervention strategies. The story of Jonestown continues to resonate today because the underlying dynamics that made it possible are still present in our society. Economic inequality, social isolation, and political polarization create conditions where people are vulnerable to messages of simple solutions and absolute answers. The rise of social media has created new opportunities for manipulative leaders to reach and influence potential followers. Understanding Jonestown requires us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and social organization. It shows us that ordinary people can be led to participate in extraordinary evil under the right circumstances. It demonstrates the power of gradual indoctrination and the importance of maintaining critical thinking skills even within groups we love and trust. But perhaps most importantly, the story of Jonestown reminds us of the value of individual human life and the responsibility we all have to protect the vulnerable members of our society. The 918 people who died in that jungle clearing were not statistics or symbols, but individuals with names, faces, dreams, and stories. Their deaths were a tragedy, not just for their families, but for all of humanity. As we remember their lives and mourn their deaths, we must also commit ourselves to learning from their tragedy. We must remain vigilant against the kind of psychological manipulation that led to their deaths, while also staying open to the genuine community and social justice they were seeking. In this way, we can honor their memory by ensuring that such exploitation never happens again, and by working to build the kind of just and compassionate society they thought they were creating in the jungles of Kiona.